Thank you very much. Thank you very much for having me. I know it's tough, late afternoon, but hopefully this will be engaging, or at least engaging enough. My name is David Mejia-Canales, and I'm a senior human rights lawyer at the Human Rights Law Centre. The main things that I do there are around participation rights, the right to vote, the right to protest, as well as the right to participate in public affairs. I just want to take a moment, as has already been done, but if we could just even reflect on the fact that as far as your eye can see, everything that your feet touch on this country is, was, and will be Aboriginal land. And I recognise that, and particularly centering this talk because First Nations people have resisted colonisation since the very, very first ships sailed into Gadigal, Bidjigal and Wongal waters, including through protest. In fact, the Aboriginal Tent Embassy is the longest continuous protest in the world for Indigenous land rights. And it is here in Canberra. It's not here in Canberra, here in Australia in Canberra. This is not Canberra. So the Pact for the Future in International Human Rights. So yes, we've heard a lot today about the transformative potential of the Pact to address critical global challenges, climate change being one of them, an excellent presentation just before mine, but also inequality. We also heard a little bit about technological risks, a little bit about health, and we've heard a little bit about the universality of human rights. And that's good. That's the point of human rights. They're meant to be universal and indivisible. They come together as a package. They don't compete with each other. And they are universal, at least they should be. So I'll talk about the Pact, some of the strengths, some of the criticisms, and some of the recommendations. But I really want to emphasize that it has been said before already, and I want to emphasize it again, that the Pact is a rare opportunity to reshape global governance and reaffirm human rights. When you actually take a step back and think about our human rights law as a body of law, it's actually not very old. There are some obviously like key documents and key principles of human rights that can be traced back for a lot longer than the existence of the United Nations, or at least the international system. But human rights law as a body of law is not very old. And it has achieved a lot in that short amount of time. But I think we are now at a crossroads for a whole lot of reasons. Climate change is one of them, but also, it has been said before already, the fact that our communities have broken down, but in many ways they are so big that we cannot conceptualize them. Because it's probably easier for some of us to talk to someone who is on the other side of the world than our neighbours. So, why the Pact matters. I mean, I think it's pretty straightforward and it's not controversial at all, that it is just an opportunity to reaffirm human rights, and we should always take up the opportunity to reaffirm human rights. Human rights are a good thing to reaffirm and to affirm and to talk about and to pull apart and to discuss, because that's how we arrive at much better processes. And in fact, that's how we've arrived at protection for environmental rights. It was through a constant negotiation and talking about, well, this is why these things are important. And you can't have human rights on a planet that doesn't exist, or a planet that is burnt to a crisp. So it is an ambitious attempt to align global governance with the principles of justice, sustainability, and solidarity in the United Nations Charter. But it is, I think, one of the most important things about the Pact is that it actually looks at interconnected challenges through a unified approach. And that is probably one of its strengths. It's getting everyone in a room together to reaffirm the commitment to human rights, to sustainable development, and to the protection of future generations. These things are absolutely fundamental. And it is just part of the process that they continuously be reaffirmed, especially now. And I'll talk about some of the challenges in a second. Some of the challenges that we face right now to the full fulfillment of our human rights. And when I'm talking about, the fulfillment of human rights, I also do mean in Australia, I suppose what's a better way of putting this? The kind of compliance or the lack of compliance with human rights law is not something that happens over somewhere else. It also happens here. In Australia, there's only 3 jurisdictions that have a Human Rights Act. The ACT has been mentioned, Victoria and Queensland. But as a recent example would show you, here in Queensland, it can be suspended to pass some quite questionable laws. So the protections for your human rights, at least in legislation, are patchy. The right to protest is sort of very loosely protected, maybe, possibly under the Constitution in Australia. But whether you can protest peacefully might also depend on where you live. And that's not how human rights work. Well, at least that's not how they're meant to. So at its core, the Pact provides a roadmap for achieving justice. And maybe not even a roadmap as such, it just provides a hopeful destination, because there isn't a whole lot of things in the Pact that sort of outline exactly how we're going to get to where we're going. And I could probably argue that had it probably done that, it may not have been effective. So in some ways, yes, there are all these really motherhood statements about the things that we're going to do and the things we want to do, but I think it's really important that these were arrived at through consensus, internationally, with people coming together to talk about these things. And as I said before, that's actually how we advance progress, by talking together and resolving differences that way. There's 3 pillars that we've already discussed today about human rights, environmental justice, and technological governance. Technological governance is a key one. As you know, we sort of said before, AI seems to be the hottest sort of topic at the moment, which I think is good, but we were definitely not talking about AI 2 years ago. So these things also have to be flexible enough to change, while also being specific enough for you to be able to sort of measure your progress against them. So I don't envy the fact that these things were negotiated and they're renegotiated, because this is really, really difficult. This is how we arrive at better processes. But the human rights pillar in particular, I mean, I think is a good thing. It underscores the universality and indivisibility of civil, political, and socio-economic rights. In Australia, at least the Australian Human Rights Acts that we have in the jurisdictions that do have them, they usually do focus on civil and political rights more so than socio-economic rights. So we also have a lot of work to do here in this country, and indeed here in this state. We've spoken about the environmental justice pillar a little bit, but it's committing to bold actions, phasing out fossil fuels, this sort of thing, and the technological governance pillar that has already been talked about today, about the need for ethical AI and bridging digital divides, which is a good thing. And this is one of my favorite photos, at least in this sort of sphere. That's Eleanor Roosevelt holding the Universal Declaration on human rights, and she was absolutely instrumental in getting that document through the many different processes that it had to go through, and it exists. So the change is possible. It is hard and it's tricky and it takes a long time, especially at the international level, but it's possible. This happened. So the Pact centres around, the Pact centres human rights, I should say, by focusing on dignity, equality, and the protection of vulnerable groups. In fact, that's the whole purpose of human rights law. It is to ensure human dignity and to prevent human suffering where possible. Now, it commits to safeguarding civic space, and that's absolutely fundamental. So if you look at the things that I do, that was at a protest that I was at for work. My job is wild. I get to go to protests and get paid for them, but not as a paid protester, just as someone who's there to make sure people are not going to be arrested. But this was taken because the South Australian government introduced an anti-protest law that would have made it, I think it was at fines of $30,000 for blocking a public space. And that could have been you sitting on a bench, could have been you sitting on a train, it could have been you blocking a doorway. Of course, maybe you're not going to get a $30,000 fine for blocking a doorway, but it did give the police. Is that right? That's brilliant. Well, thank them for being on my slide. But if you look at this law was actually passed in 22 minutes in the lower house. and it sought to impact people's rights to be in public. It also would have made it, you would have had to pay the police for coming out to attend to your obstruction, on top of any fine or any imprisonment that a court ordered. There is no Human Rights Act in South Australia, so the Parliament did do this in 22 minutes because there were no considerations that the Parliament had to give to people's human rights. Safeguarding civic space is absolutely fundamental, especially because a lot of us now spend time in spaces that are public spaces, but they're privately owned. Now, how important would it be to safeguard civic space? I think it is absolutely critical. There's no point in having the right to peaceful assembly and association if you can't actually use it. So safeguarding public space is really important, particularly safeguarding human rights defenders. If there's no one to do the human rights defending, then human rights are not going to be very effective. And each one of these people, colleague included, are human rights defenders. So making sure that they are also protected in their work in either compiling information about human rights abuses or disseminating it is really, really important. And that's good that it is in the Pact. But it's also essential for democratic resilience. We need human rights defenders, whether it's at universities, whether it's indeed on the steps of Parliament House, or whether it's just down on the street with a placard, because that is actually that is the purest manifestation of democracy. It's not just voting, it's actually taking part and being part of civic life. And the Pact seeks to protect that. What the Pact doesn't seek to protect as much is the role of civil society, not-for-profit organisations and non-governmental organisations who are also involved in the protection of human rights, like a whole lot of these folks here. And over here on the side, there was a group of abortion campaigners who were also there because the laws impacted them. And they managed to win so many things. And if you've been following the news, there was a law that was proposed in the South Australian Upper House to wind back some of those protections. And those human rights defenders were key in keeping that law out. The bill out of from becoming an act. So these commitments are integral, and they're meant to integrate human rights into all aspects of its vision. It does that actually quite well, because it's not just human rights law that we should be looking at, but also human rights principles and standards, like to be free from discrimination is a key component of human rights law, but also the ability to participate in public life is a key kind of principle in human rights law, especially if there's a decision that's going to be made that is going to impact your human rights. I'll give you an example. I've just been in the Parliament on the social media ban. We've been trying to stop that. And if we couldn't stop it, we were trying to delay it. And if we couldn't delay it, then we're probably going to go to court about it. Because the government only gave 24 hours for the whole country to give its thoughts on the matter. Regardless of what you think about the legislation, giving 24 hours for a legislation that could actually really severely impact the privacy rights of everybody is not good practice. That is not compliant with human rights law because it doesn't allow enough time for public participation. So what are the challenges? I mean, bad faith actors misusing human rights language, I think, is one that is key. If you look here, this is one of the anti-lockdown protests in Sydney. My body, my choice is actually a slogan that came out of the movements to secure or to protect safe abortion access. I don't think it was meant to be used against vaccine passports, which didn't really exist. But not trying to also police language either. People can use words, that's the point. That is also a key fundamental pillar of human rights, the freedom of expression and the right to seek and impart information. But the way that we're having these conversations is getting really distorted. Take another thing that I've been working on recently, and that is the mis- and disinformation bill. That bill died, and we think that's really unfortunate. And the reason why it didn't get any sort of broad support is because there was a deep, deep misunderstanding of what the freedom of expression actually is. And in fact, it was weaponized by people who did not want any legislation in this space. The freedom of speech doesn't allow you to say whatever you like if it's going to harm another person. But that got completely lost in the debate. And in fact, when I was meeting with people in Parliament, meeting with senators, it was obvious to me that they hadn't read the legislation at all. Because, one very high-profile person said to me, I can't vote for it because it's going to impact the freedom of speech, and I needed to have these 3 things to be able to secure my support. And I said, oh, well, you haven't read it, Senator, because those 3 things are in there. But it was this philosophical argument about the freedom of speech, that they should be able to say whatever you like. That's not how the freedom of speech works. But this misunderstanding of the human right concept led to this bill not succeeding. So I think we do have that as a challenge, but another is that we don't have a human rights culture as such in this country. It's growing and it's expanding because of the work of these incredible human rights defenders all over the place. But we don't have a human rights culture. We don't even have a Human Rights Act at the federal level. If we had a human rights culture, I don't think a government would think that 24 hours for a very complicated piece of legislation, 24 hours for consultation, is a good idea, or even less, let alone desirable. So I want you to take this a little bit with a grain of salt. What needs strengthening? Yes, there are weak accountability mechanisms in the pact. That's true. That is true. It's also vague as to how people, how nation states are going to implement it. But there is also a risk of it being used as a weapon in politics. I'll give you an example. I was born in El Salvador. One of the things in the pact is to sort of, we condemn terrorism. The president of El Salvador has called the gangs terrorists. Now, are some of them committing acts that could look like terrorism? Yeah, absolutely, but not all of them. But now they're all terrorists, and that means that 6% of all Salvadorans are in jail because they got all swept up as terrorists. And you could see how a government would say, well, I'm fulfilling my version of the pact. I'm combating terrorism. There's an element of truth to that, but it's not fully true. But there's also limits to how much you can achieve and how many accountability mechanisms you can build into an agreement. That at the end of the day, this is how the enforcement of international law looks like. People think that it's this incredible, gargantuan thing, and it is. It is vitally important. But when you actually come down to how do you enforce it, it's a lot harder because it actually requires our government to act according to what it said it would at the international level. We haven't done that yet for some of the bigger legally binding treaties, like the International Covenant of Civil Political Rights or Social Economic Rights. We haven't done our part fully there. We've gone a long way. We have. But it's not complete because at the end of the day, you also have to contend with domestic politics. And that's where a lot of things might actually end up getting stuck. So in conclusion, I think the way that we strengthen the pact, these recommendations here are actually more for our own government at all levels. We need to embed accountability into how we do things, into our laws, into our policies, into our practices. We also have to counter the misuse of human rights language and principles too. All of us, not just our government, that's all of us. And we need to create actionable strategies to what we said that we would do at the international level. So I guess the final thing that I will say about reaffirming the vision, and if you look here, that's actually the very first meeting of the League of Nations, which is the precursor of the United Nations, and you might notice there's not a whole lot of women or a whole lot of brown folks. But that's where it started. It did fall apart very quickly, but the idea continued, and we have the United Nations now. But yes, we do need a framework for global justice. I'm not arguing against one. And we do actually need bold actions to deliver on all aspects of the United Nations Charter, not just the plan. all of it. But the thing is that that point, whether this is going to succeed or not, it's actually up to us. It's not up to our governments. It's not, well, I mean, strictly speaking, it is. But it's not, our governments won't do it if we don't make them. So whether this is going to work or not is actually up to us. Thank you.